whiteness and like the color of your skin was like the defining factor of why colonists thought they were better than other people, and like why they thought they had the right to like take their land, and why they were better and impose their culture, religion, all that stuff. That definitely still exists today because we still have different complexions, and it's still like subconsciously like, oh, this difference about me, the way I move through the world, the different privileges I have, are like, that's why it's better, and that's why it's still different and systemic in that sense. And I think that people of color and like minorities, like, that's still kind of enrooted in how we move through the world.
So when I think about colonization, I go back to when Christopher Columbus came to America and kind of took the land from the natives here. And my parents are from the Caribbean. So when I think about like Hispaniola history, it's kind of like there are two different sides of the island. One side was dictated by the French, while the other side was dictated by Spaniards. And it just like colonization has like such a deep-rooted like history in that it's like in the DR, a lot of people are prone to being white. Like there's so much white, like bleaching, trying to act white. Like I'm Dominican and I'm really dark, and I have heard so many people talk in Spanish about how like, oh, she's black, like, oh my god, she's so black, without them realizing that I understand what they're saying. And it's kind of like that racism that's still deep-rooted into the history. Also, we had like a dictator in DR where he was so into like being white, he would put powder on his face to be whiter, and he also gave free chunks of land to white people so they would integrate with the people, so people would become lighter and not darker.
So I guess when I'm thinking about whiteness and its relation to colonialism, I'm specifically thinking about a US context, and one of the first things that pops into my mind is that context in regards to higher education. So something that I'm thinking about is when we're thinking of colonization in the US context, and we're thinking about like the Europeans coming to this area, and specifically in regards to whiteness, is how is whiteness then the center of everything, right? Because when you have colonization, it's on this whole spectrum of this power dynamic, right? Who has power and who doesn't? And when you had the Europeans that came here and colonized this land, and you had like the genocide of indigenous people, that creates that whole power hierarchy that we now have today. So specifically with higher education, right? In like institutions of higher education were created through slave labor and also through the genocide of indigenous people, specifically to create institutions of higher education for white men who are also like Christian, cisgender, heterosexual, etc. So when you have these institutions and these systems that were created for these people with that intention, then that's going to have lasting effects today. So higher education today is still created on that same foundation, and that's how it shows up today, right? So when we think of like the SAT, for example, those types of things don't necessarily test knowledge that somebody knows more than they test what kind of privilege somebody has, because do they have access for test prep for that, right? And a lot of that is rooted in whiteness and classism. So
we need to figure out how to rework our thinking on all of the sides in order for people to be like actually equal and actually respected and actually moving through the world the way we were kind of like originally intended to. You can't have like these underlying thoughts of like, oh, I'm better than them because of this, like regardless of what it is. If it's the way you look, the way you speak, how much money you make, where you're from, what you sound like, you can't have one without the other. So it needs to start kind of like where the problem started, and then we can kind of figure out where to go from there.
Decolonization could free me from colonial bondage just by not putting, like, I don't know how to explain this. Like, as a black woman living in Vermont, the whitest state in America, I was stopped by a police officer for having a pink backpack. Now, if I was of lighter skin tone, I don't think that would ever have happened to me, but it did. And that was the scariest moment in my life because I really thought I was gonna have 7 holes in my back. I think that many white people are prone to having these thoughts that if you're a person of color, they already have pre-assumed notions about what your intent is in society, and that's racism that they have inherited through the DNA. That's something that is like been there since Columbus came, and it's not going to go away. I think like even like scientists have proved bias is something that you can't live without. So if you take decolonization, I think it would be better for people of color, just because you wouldn't have white people always assuming that black people are up to no good.
And I think it's also important to note that when we're talking about decolonization, it is so important to center Indigenous sovereignty within that conversation, right? Because I think a lot of the times decolonization can end up being a buzzword that just kind of means like, oh, like let's reflect on colonization and what that means. But I think it's so important that when we're specifically talking about decolonization, that we center Indigenous people. And when I'm thinking about that, that means to center like Indigenous people in what should society be moving forwards, right? Like now that we understand, or if we understand the systems of how colonization affects society today, what should we be doing to move forward? If we want to center liberation in society, what does that look like and how is that created? I think it's like this conversation that embodies multiple people, but has to be very centered in who is having those conversations.